We used a powerful AI model to simulate two of the most ideologically opposed figures of the Cold War era. On one side stands John F. Kennedy, the charismatic leader of the free world, who believed in defending democracy through strategic intervention. On the other side, Che Guevara, the revolutionary icon who fought for global liberation from capitalist oppression and Western imperialism. To help everyone follow the discussion, both speakers have agreed to explain their ideas in simple, modern language while staying true to their original beliefs. To keep things fair, we've recruited 5 AI models to act as impartial judges to see which arguments they would evaluate as stronger. Watch closely, resist the urge to skip ahead, and let the arguments speak for themselves. The debate begins now with a question at the heart of the 20th century, and perhaps our present. Should a powerful country like the United States get involved in other countries' affairs to stop the spread of a different belief system, like communism?
Ernesto, if I may start. The world we live in today and the freedoms people enjoy in countries like mine are being threatened by an idea that tries to force itself on others, often through violence. When we talk about communism, we're not just talking about a different way of running the economy. We're talking about a system that, in real life, often takes away people's rights, silences their voices, and creates governments that control everything. If we just stand by and do nothing while more and more countries fall under this kind of control, that's not keeping the peace, it's avoiding our responsibility. The United States, because of its values and place in the world, has a duty to help people who are fighting to be free. Helping them, when done wisely, isn't an act of war. It's standing up for the values that make the world fair and peaceful. We don't want to take over other countries. We want to help them make their own choices without being forced into anything by powerful countries like those led from Moscow, Beijing, or Havana.
We asked several large language models to score each response from 0 to 100 based on these 10 criteria. The score these models gave to President Kennedy's first response is as follows.
President Kennedy, when you talk about standing up for principles, it doesn't mean much to the millions of people who have suffered under American companies, long before they even knew who Karl Marx was. You say the U.S. steps in to help those who want freedom. But what about the freedom of countries that choose a different path? One that challenges the unfair systems built and supported by America's power. The communism you fear is actually a reaction to real pain and injustice. Like farmers who work hard but stay poor, workers whose labor makes others rich, and countries whose natural resources are taken for foreign gain. When the U.S. gets involved, it's rarely about protecting personal freedoms. It's usually about protecting American business interests, keeping friendly governments in power, and stopping movements that try to take back control, especially if they want to nationalize things like fruit or oil industries. You say your actions are morally right, but they mostly help keep the world safe for the rich and powerful, while hurting the poor and powerless. You criticize authoritarian governments, but the U.S. has often supported brutal dictators, as long as they were against communism. So whose freedom are you really defending when you send in troops, spies, or bombers? Many of these countries just want to make their own decisions without being controlled by the U.S. Your idea of freedom of choice doesn't mean much when the only acceptable choice is whatever suits Washington.
Ernesto, the way you describe America's actions makes them seem purely selfish, but that's not the full picture. You ignore the real belief many Americans have in trying to do good, even if the results aren't always perfect. You talk as if it's all just about making money, but you don't mention the growth and stability that U.S. investments and leadership have brought to many places. Just look at Western Europe, which recovered after World War II with our help through the Marshall Plan and now thrives under democratic capitalism. Compare that to Eastern Europe, which was stuck behind the Iron Curtain with poor economies and limited freedoms. Yes, the U.S. has made mistakes in its foreign policy. No country is perfect. But the basic idea behind our actions is to stand against the spread of communism, which often comes with governments that ban free speech, free press, public gatherings, and private ownership. You talk about real independence, but what about the Hungarians in 1956 who tried to stand up for themselves and were crushed by Soviet tanks? Or the Czechs in 1948, and again during the Prague Spring, who had no real choice in their future? These weren't about protecting companies. They were people fighting for the same freedoms we believe in. When we do step in, it's to help stop the spread of this kind of control. If we don't help countries under threat, who will? Should they turn to your version of revolution, which often replaces one form of control with another, and which has sometimes worked closely with the Soviet Union's own power grabs? Saying our support for flawed but allied governments is just as bad as the strict oppressive rule seen in communist states isn't fair. We believe it's better to help democracy grow, even if it takes time and effort, than to leave people stuck under one-party rule with no real freedom.
Your comparison to the Marshall Plan and Western Europe is interesting, Mr. President. But there is a big difference. The countries in Western Europe were already developed and industrial, even though they had been damaged by war. Your aid went into systems that were ready to use it in a capitalist way. In a sense, you were rebuilding countries that were already like yours. But what about Latin America? What about Africa and Asia? For hundreds of years, these continents have provided resources and cheap labor for your growing economies. When we try to build something for ourselves, using our own resources for our own people, your idealism starts to look like a wish to keep us dependent on you. You talk about the grim realities of Eastern Europe. I won't deny that building socialist states is complex and mistakes have been made. As Mao once said, revolution is not a dinner party. It's a major and difficult change. But these struggles come from a desire to escape a deeper and harsher system, global capitalism. This system lets children in Bolivia go hungry, while investors in New York grow rich. You rightly criticize the repression in Hungary. But where was your concern? When Batista, whom your country supported, killed 20,000 Cubans. Where is your strong moral position when your allies in Saigon torture and kill people who just want a united and independent Vietnam? Your so-called bulwark against the tide is really a wall built to block the hopes and goals of the world's poor. The coercion and economic hardship you blame on revolutions often come directly from your own actions. Your blockades, your sanctions, your constant efforts to stop any country from trying something different. Cuba is a clear example. We tried to educate our people, give everyone health care, and return land to the farmers. And how did you respond? You launched an invasion at Playa Girón. You tried to crush us economically, and that pressure still continues. You push us toward other world powers by threatening us if we don't do what you want. So when you speak about choice, it feels empty. The choice you give us is either obey or be punished. Is that really the freedom you believe in?
Ernesto, I can see that you truly care about the poor and oppressed. No fair-minded person can ignore the serious problems of poverty and exploitation in Latin America and other places. That's why we started programs like the Alliance for Progress. It's a real effort to support economic growth and democracy in the Americas by working with our neighbors, not forcing anything on them. But you mix up the fight for fair social change with the spread of communism from other countries. It's true that Batista's government in Cuba was corrupt and harsh. By the time I became president, the United States had already stopped supporting him. The Cuban people had every right to want change. Still, the revolution you and Fidel Castro led, though it began with promises of more freedom, quickly turned into a system that took away rights. It took property without fair process, silenced people who disagreed, shut down the free press, and sided with the Soviet Union, a country that threatens the free world. Our actions toward Cuba, like the trade embargo and the Bay of Pigs invasion, which I admit was poorly handled, were not meant to hurt the Cuban people. They were a reaction to Cuba becoming a partner of the Soviet Union. That turned the island into a military and political base just 90 miles from our coast, aiming to spread its revolution throughout the region. You mention the Bay of Pigs, but you leave out the fact that the Soviets later put missiles in Cuba, which nearly caused a nuclear war. Was that really Cuban independence, or a dangerous move that risked the lives of people all over the world? The embargo is a tough measure, yes, but it is a peaceful way to pressure a government that continues to harm its own people and threaten others nearby. You ask why we didn't speak out for Batista's victims. Politics inside any country are complicated. Sometimes we have to work with governments that don't share all our values in order to deal with a bigger threat. In this case, a worldwide communist movement that is against democracy and wants to expand its control. It's not an easy choice, but during the Cold War, it was one we felt we had to make.
President Kennedy, your Alliance for Progress may sound like a good idea, but it hides the truth. It gives small benefits while keeping the unfair systems that hurt poor countries in place. You talk about working with Latin American countries, but it's always on your terms. It supports a type of economy that helps the U.S., not one that helps us become truly independent or make deep changes where they're needed most. You offer loans that lead to debt and help that keeps us tied to your businesses. You called the Bay of Pigs a mistake in how it was carried out, but you didn't admit that the real mistake was the plan itself. You wanted to remove a government by force. This came after you said you no longer supported Batista, but the U.S. backed him for years because he protected American business. You only started pulling away from him when his government became too corrupt to ignore, and when our revolution became too strong to stop. You also mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Let's be honest, the missiles were meant to defend us. Cuba has always faced serious threats from the U.S. We had already been attacked once with your CIA behind it. We believed it would happen again. The Soviet Union offered us help, and we accepted it to protect ourselves. Should we have just waited, defenseless, for another attack? It was your threatening behavior that led to that crisis. You talk about peace in the region. But how can there be peace when one country, like yours, thinks it can decide how all others should run their economies and governments? You say that supporting violent dictators like Somoza in Nicaragua or Trujillo in the Dominican Republic was a hard choice to fight communism. But this is exactly the kind of double standard that leads people to rise up. You say you believe in freedom and democracy, but you support leaders who crush those things, as long as they are against communism. You side with the rich, the powerful, and the military who exploit their people. So it's no surprise that people turn to more extreme solutions. You are creating the very problems you claim to be fighting. And while you say you're choosing the best of bad options, it always ends up helping the powerful and hurting the poor.
Ernesto, it seems like you believe the United States is only capable of acting out of selfish interests. But to say that everything we do is meant to control or harm others is not true. It doesn't reflect our full intentions or what we're capable of doing for good. Look at what happened after World War II. The United States stepped into a leadership role. This wasn't because we wanted to build an empire like the old European powers. It was because if we didn't, there would be a power vacuum. That gap could have been filled by Soviet influence, or it could have led to chaos around the world. We didn't just help Western Europe recover, we also helped Japan, which had been our enemy. Now Japan is a strong democracy, showing what's possible when we combine aid with support for freedom and reform. You only focus on the times we supported bad governments, because they opposed communism. That's only part of the story. We've also supported democratic movements and given aid without expecting anything in return, simply because we believe it's the right thing to do. I started the Peace Corps to send young Americans to help others, to teach, to build, to share knowledge. Is that part of a conspiracy too? Communism isn't just an idea we made up to fear. Many communist movements have openly said they want to tear down existing societies. They promote class conflict, which often turns violent, and they create one-party governments that take away people's basic rights. We can't ignore that. You called the Soviet missiles in Cuba defensive, but they were powerful nuclear weapons aimed at our cities with little warning. That was an aggressive move. It wasn't about protecting Cuba. It was about giving the Soviet Union more power. If we hadn't responded strongly, the situation could have gotten much worse. Sometimes, taking a strong stand is the only way to avoid a bigger conflict. Our goal is not to control others, but to stop dangerous ideologies from controlling the world.
President Kennedy, your Peace Corps volunteers may be kind and well-meaning, but they often go to countries where the U.S. government has already shaped the situation through its economic policies and secret operations. These volunteers show a friendlier side of an empire that is not always so kind. It's good that a young person wants to dig a well, but we must remember that the need for that well might exist, because your country's actions over many years have taken resources from these places, leaving them poor and unable to care for their own people. You talk about rebuilding Japan. Yes, it was a big achievement, but Japan was rebuilt to stop the spread of communism in Asia. It was made to fit into your global capitalist system. I don't deny that Japan became successful, but let's be honest, it was not done out of pure kindness. There were clear political and economic goals. You say that communism goes against human rights. That is a broad claim that fits your view. But what about the right to food, shelter, health care, education, and a job? In many capitalist countries, especially poor ones, these rights are denied to millions of people. This is not always because of a one-party government, but because the economic system keeps wealth and power in the hands of a small group, often helped by your global companies. You fear a one-party state, but ignore how economic power in your system creates a situation where only the rich truly have control, no matter how democratic the system appears. As for the missiles in Cuba, they were a response, not an act of random aggression. The real aggression was your constant effort to destroy our revolution. If your government had respected our independence and tried to build a relationship based on mutual respect, maybe the world would not have come so close to disaster in October 1962. But your policy of containment is really a policy of attacking any country that tries to break free from your control. You call it firmness, but people around the world who suffer under your influence see it as the stubbornness of a powerful nation that refuses to accept different ways of living.
The fight for freedom is the biggest moral issue of our time. The United States was founded on the idea of liberty, and we cannot ignore it when freedom is slowly being taken away around the world by those who promote hatred and rule by force. We know we are not perfect, and we sometimes make mistakes. Being a powerful country in a complicated world means we face tough decisions, but we are always guided by our belief in protecting freedom, supporting all nations' right to choose their own paths, and trusting that the best future for everyone lies in open, democratic societies where people work together freely. We do not want to control other countries. We want to build a world where free countries are strong, independent, and at peace. Sometimes, helping create that world means taking hard actions, even getting involved in conflicts. We do this not to force others to do what we want, but to stop even worse forces from taking over. Freedom can be expensive, but we are ready to pay the price for ourselves and for anyone else who wants to be free.
Human history is a story of the weak fighting against those who hold power. Today, modern capitalism is the strongest form of oppression. It keeps billions of people poor and suffering while a small group gets rich. Talking about freedom and democracy while protecting this system is dishonest. Real freedom is not just being able to vote or buy things. It means being free from hunger, from being used by others, from ignorance, and from control by foreign powers. This kind of freedom will not be given by those in power. It must be taken through the united and conscious effort of the people. Revolution is not a dream for the future. It is something we need now. It is painful but necessary to create a better and fairer world. We support all people who fight for their rights and who want to build a society based on equality, unity, and shared well-being. The United States, through its actions, has shown it supports injustice around the world. So wherever people rise up to fight this injustice, that is where we must be. We will stand with them and fight until we win or die trying. The fight for a better future continues, and we will not stop until the world is free from exploitation. Victory always.
This debate wasn't just a clash of words, it was a collision of ideologies. JFK argued for calculated intervention and moral duty to preserve global freedom. Che Guevara countered with a relentless critique of capitalist imperialism, championing the fight for oppressed peoples through radical transformation. While both offered compelling arguments, the cumulative scores reflect a pattern. Ernesto Che Guevara's voice echoed louder, round after round, with clearer conviction, sharper moral clarity, and a relentless challenge to the existing order. Keep in mind that the content of this debate, and consequently the scores, depended on the initial prompt and the evaluation criteria. The goal was to see how two large language models debate with each other, and in the process, perhaps we as humans could learn something from this discussion. In the end, this wasn't just a debate about policy. It was about who defines freedom, who gets to fight for it. But the questions raised remain open for all of us. Subscribe here for more videos.